Okay, we're going to make up a wheat bread dough now. Now to do that, what I need is my mixing bowl. I use an old washing up bowl. This is my wheat flour, so I'm going to make it on the basis of white flour, just because I happen to have quite a bit of that lying around at the moment, so I'm going to use that first. I've got the remnants, a few grams, probably about, I don't know, 80 to 100 grams of spelt flour left over from a previous loaf. I'm going to just dump that in there as well. Spelt is a type of wheat, so that'll go fine. I've got some salt here, so we'll just measure that out, and then I've got my my ferment. Now, can we see this? I'm going to put this on the primer, but basically this is the bread recipe that I'm using. And what you can see here are the quantities of the individual ingredients plus the baker's percentage. So the 500 grams flour that we start with, that becomes 100%, and everything else then is calculated as a percentage off that. So the water, I'm aiming for around 65% water content, so that will turn out to be about 325 grams. I'm looking for 2.5% of salt, which would be 12.5 grams, and the starter I want about 25%, so 125 grams. As I said in one of the earlier introductory videos, I'm not particularly accurate at this. I'm a bit slapdash, and what I do is I add water or flour if I need to change the dough consistency, and you'll pick that up through experience as time goes on. So let's start. So we put the bowl on the balance here. I tear that off, and I start building my my ingredients. So I've got starting to show tear now at 0. So I'm going to start with just dumping all that spelt flour into it. That started, it'll give it quite a base note, quite a nutty base note. Oh, look at that, 101 grams. How accurate was that assumption to start with? So another 400 grams of strong white bread flour. In the primer I talk about flour choice and so on. You can read about that at your leisure. The video was a bit overexposed when I was showing it earlier, but this is Wessex Mill. For those of you who live in Chester, I get these flours from Francis Thomas, the veg shop now in Northgate. I've been buying some online stuff from Shipton Mill, but under the current crisis I've just had an email from them to say they're not taking any more orders online because they're bombed out. So everyone's at home making up the bread. Right. So that's 500 grams of flour, and so we wanted 12.5 grams of salt. So I'm just going to tear that back again and put, I mean, if it works out at 15, that's fine. I don't particularly want it at 20. We're trying to cut down salt intake at the moment. Now the salt is coming in here not as a flavour enhancer, well, maybe a little bit, but really because it has some functional properties on the development of the gluten network. And what we're about to do in this next stage, which is kneading the dough, is about developing the protein in the flour, which is called the gluten. And that gluten will give you a network of bubbles, which are filled then by the carbon dioxide that's created by the fermentation of the yeast, and that expands, and that's what makes your bread rise. So we're going to put in now the yeast starter. Sorry, the starter, which we've calculated here at 125. I'm trying to be accurate, you see, for this. I'm not normally quite as precise as this. I just dump in what looks like half, and I put half back into my jar of starter. But today we're going to be super good and do this. So okay, I dropped up to about 140, but that's fine. Yeah, doesn't look as enough. Don't like it. Going to put more in. Work it out as I normally do it. Like I said at the start, I might not be showing you the exact precise way that a textbook would do. I'm just showing you what I would do. Now, this point, this is worth pointing out that the pure sourdough bakers won't use yeast. They don't use it at all. They say they get the fermentation from the lactic acid bacteria. That's fine. I actually like to use a little bit of yeast. I think it needs the power of the carbon dioxide and production of commercial yeast, which you just don't get from lactic acid bacteria. So I'm going to pop a little bit of yeast in, which I didn't get the pot out, so I'm just going to drag that out of the larder. And that, as I say, is just to help the fermentation. Now the fermentation process is where all the flavour, and because of the enzymatic, so what I do is I just measure out a bit onto the lid. This is a tin of dried yeast. I don't use fresh yeast. I can hunt it down and get it, but it's a pain in the neck, and this is absolutely fine, does the job I need it to do. Fermentation is where the flavour and texture of the bread is developed, and that comes from the fermentation action of the yeast, so acting to sucking up food from the flour, produces alcohol and carbon dioxide, which contributes to the leavening. The lactic acid, the starter cultures, that also creates a certain amount of gassing fermentation activity, but because you've got quite a lot of complex enzyme action going on in that, is that it really unlocks a lot of the goodness. This is very crude speak. I mean, there's a whole field of cereal science in here where you've got all the cereal scientists spinning and throwing their heads up in horror at this kind of description. But basically, it's going to unlock a lot of the goodness that's in the flour. Now, as I said before, I don't use a machine. I use my hands. My hands are all I need to work the dough. What we're going to do is, when we're working the dough, what we're trying to do is to develop that protein, make it nice and elastic, so you've got a very elastic dough. And we're going to do this in 5 rather similar steps. But the first thing to do is to get your dough mixed up so that it's a reasonable consistency to start to work it. So what I do is I mix in the wet ferment, so that that's sort of distributed nicely through the flour. Doing this is bringing the salt and the dried yeast along with it, so you've got quite a nice little mixture. It gets a little bit crumbly. There's some great smells that start to come up from this as well, great aromas, you know, the potential of the fermentation and the baking. You start to really feel what your bread's going to be like and smell it. And okay, so almost alcoholic, it's really delicious. I feel like a glass of wine now. Okay, now what I've done here with the water, I've calculated I need 325. As I say, I'm not absolutely certain what the moisture content on my starter is, so this could be a little bit less than, it probably will be a little bit less than 325. So what I'm going to do is to pour in sort of roughly 2/3 of it and start to draw all the flour into the moisture in the middle of the bowl. And this is where experience comes in. You start to feel if that dough is too loose, so in other words it's got too much water in, or too stiff, so in other words it doesn't have enough water in, and you can adjust accordingly. Now obviously a lot of the water has gone into this little bit here. Hoping we can see all that. Yeah, I think we can. And so I'm just going to move that around a little bit, but it's feeling to me too stiff. I'm not picking up the residual flour, although the stuff on my hand is actually quite sticky. So I'm nearly there, but I'm not really very happy with that. So I'm going to give it a little bit more water. A sourdough long fermentation, you see there, I didn't put very much in, just a little bit to start sort of picking up the remnants of the flour here, and you can easily just tip over the edge and put too much in if you're a bit heavy-handed with that water jug at that point. So I've lost my train of what I was trying to explain, but there we go. So we're just going to get a so-called sourdough, piece of paper, so-called sourdough bread is a highly hydrated dough, so it's going to have a lot more water in it than, say, the stuff that goes through your Warburtons or your Hovis factories, because that just is used during the fermentation process, during the baking, during the rising, to make the texture nice. Now, what happens with this is that as you rest the dough, it relaxes and becomes a bit drier, so it absorbs the water into the dough itself. When I started making my doughs in this way, using this technique, it suggested a four stage process, which I'll show you in just a second. I've now turned this into a fifth session, so fifth step. So my first step is to mix up the dough, just get that hydration feeling right, and then I leave it for about 20 minutes, and I call that a resting period. And what that does is it tends to absorb water into the flour and makes the dough a lot easier to handle. So having done that, you've seen there's just a very small amount of manipulation in what I've done so far, and all that is doing is just bringing the ingredients together to a level where I think that's probably about right. It's quite, you'll see that it's quite sticky, it's sticking to the bottom. And what we may find that we do later on in the process is to coat the dough in oil, which will make it much easier to manipulate and get less sticky, because as we go on, we don't want it to stick too much to the bowl. So I use oil to try and release that a little bit. Okay, so that's the first sort of combination. It's the mixing, it's bringing the ingredients together. As you see, I haven't used all the water that I measured out there. I didn't feel I needed that last bit. So I think if I calculated 325 millilitres for this, I've probably used 300. So it's of that sort of order. So okay, so we're going to come back to this in 20 minutes.